I'm Daniel Bass, manager of the South Asia program at Cornell University.
And I'm Shavin Senavaratner, graduate student in architecture at Cornell and student worker at South Asia program. You're listening to the Next Monsoon podcast, where we examine how art and culture can help us navigate the uncertain future. This podcast is part of a bigger project in the South Asia program at Cornell University. We'll be interviewing scholars from around the world to help us understand how people and artists face climate change.
In this episode, we look at how architecture can help us design a new understanding of climate change and its crisis.
Rupali Gupte is an architect and urbanist based in Mumbai. She is the co-founder of and professor at the School of Environment and Architecture. She is also a partner at Bard Studio. Her work focuses on housing and urban forms, tactical spatial practices, and the role of gender in shaping habitation in contemporary South Asian architecture and urbanism.
Welcome to the show, Rupali.
Thank you.
What do you first think of when you hear the word monsoon?
So if you really kind of look at what this project is doing and the whole idea of new monsoon, I think what is most important is thinking of new monsoon from the dimensions of cultural change, the cultural dimensions of climate change, because the debate on climate change is everywhere. However, this debate is today followed from the idea of through a technocratic lens. And when we think of new monsoon, for me, this idea of embedding oneself into contemporary culture is something that comes to my mind.
How do you think a cultural response can provide a different understanding than typical scientific analysis?
Yeah. So I think what is important to understand is that the debate on climate change has a longer history. It's sort of located in a larger environmental discussion that started at the turn of the last century. In the early 1900s, the idea of pollution related to issues of health started dominating questions of planning and city governance activities. In the mid-century, 60s and 70s, one sees a shift in terms of a response to massive deforestations. People are in some ways protesting against land grabs and a loss of resources. It's later in the 80s and 90s that you start seeing a push towards reduction of greenhouse gases. In the 2000s, debate is now shifted over to industries who are producing greener technologies. So in 50 years, you've seen this kind of almost insidious transformation, and how do you sort of shift that register becomes really important. So I think the kind of just locating oneself in that kind of historical shift becomes extremely important for us.
So what are some examples of those shifts that you've seen in India?
We have couched all our debates into climate change, into the argument of climate change. But things have historically kept moving, right? And cultures have adapted themselves to changes. So just to kind of give you an example, maybe not from India, but from South Asia, the question of the word bona, the idea of flood. Floods were really an important thing. The 8 monthly dikes that people built, actually after 8 months, you breach them yourself. It was important that your land flooded, it was inundated, it got fertile, and then people would build those bunds back. It's only through colonial practices where property becomes important, that you cannot have your land flood now anymore, right? And so you have embankments, you have, roads built on embankments, whereas you were actually working with environmental flows. Questions of permanence comes in. Whereas you kind of worked with the idea of flux in terms of thinking of inhabitation. So what does it then mean to, rethink some of these logics? Because today and this is where he's saying, like the idea of greenwashing becomes extremely important, and that greenwashing comes from certain ways that industries are kind of forcing us to think of a kind of consumptive logic of the environment versus a kind of logic of environment where inhabitation, life cycles, life forces become an important way of thinking.
So how has your view on climate change been informed by your background and practice as an architect and urbanist?
I can just go to a recent text that I was actually reviewing. It's called The Grammars of the Urban Ground by Asha Mean and Michele Lancioni. In some ways, it speaks of this need for new lexicons, And as an urbanist, I think that is extremely important. The new vocabularies that we build. Vocabularies are maps of life worlds of knowledge, including their hierarchies. So what are these? And again, another important argument that book makes is that instead of locating oneself in abstract structural logics, you have one ear to the ground, and you locate yourself in the messy logics of urban entanglements. What does it mean to think of inhabitation? Who are we speaking of when we speak of climate change? Who has the privilege? What is the biography of people whom we speak of? And again, in broad brush arguments, we forget to speak of particular biographies of inhabitants, and they say, very clearly that there are several arguments of the environment have actually caused evictions of the poor, in the name of environment. But I think there is a potential, as opposed to planning, that sort of works in, again, the whole disciplinary logic itself is to work with larger structures. Architecture has the potential of working at a different grain, and so does art. Like art is able to completely help you reconceptualize things. And architecture has the potential to think at a different grain, at the grain of the inhabitant, at the grain of the body, and its own location within environment. And so there's a huge potential for architects to work and at a level where one is really kind of able to think through these kind of, messy logics, but really kind of embedded logics.
So how does the School of Environment and Architecture incorporate those concerns into your teaching pedagogy?
I think it happens at every level. The third year, there's a specialization, so to say, where we focus on questions of the environment. You learn to audit things, so there's a kind of retooling. But the idea is to kind of build a sensibility into forms of living. How do you even design your life from these concerns? What does it mean to think of questions of care as a way of life and living? So I think that sort of starts, happening right from the first year all the way to the fifth year, where somebody would take up a thesis and, ask new questions from the environment, of the environment.
You were mentioning about the environmental goals at sea. How has this influenced the way that you approach with your clients and how you share with them this mode of thinking?
Right. So the kind of practice that we've also built for ourselves over the last 20 years maybe, it has also been exactly what I spoke about, so we don't have a patron dependent, client dependent practice. It's a multidisciplinary practice that sort of, it kind of straddles between art, architecture, urban studies. So a lot of the projects actually come from, all kinds of provocations. Several of them come from art funding, but several also would come from, mobilizing other partnerships with NGOs and other things. So in that sense, kind of also building this sort of a kind of practice that is embedded in the entanglements that I was speaking about.
So is there any difficulty in communicating across those different groups that you're entangled with?
Of course, you are always, because entanglements are messy.
Yeah.
Right? They're not straightforward. There's a whole kind of politics involved in it. And then that's where the role of the architect is also interesting, that, that you locate yourself in the messy logics. You're not located up there at a different vantage point, but you sort of embed yourself within things, right?
What might be an example of a project where you were in the middle of that mess and you figured out a way out?
So I mean, I wouldn't say figured out the way out. You just kind of, went with the flows, right? Like, for example, this exact project that we were speaking about, right? Like the community space that we repaired. There was this space at the back, which was, this kind of setback space that we saw and said, "Oh, fantastic! This can become a garden." It was a garbage dump. People would throw garbage from their houses, and it was a complete garbage dump. And we said, oh, we'll get the community together and we'll clean this up and we'll make this into a garden. And it was impossible, to do that, because you're working with those people didn't want to clean it up, right? So then you said, it's okay. Slowly, it was a kind of excruciatingly slow process. It's different from the way we had imagined it, but it's working, and it's kind of, it's incrementally growing, and it will change tomorrow, and that's fine. But the question is, how do you sort of plant a seed within it? It's a much nicer place. It's almost like a living room for people, right? Like after school, you have kids coming to the place, spending time there, and they've made it their own place. It's not been easy.
Yeah.
Sometimes you find like a local church would call and say, can we use that space? It's like, it's fine, okay, use it. And then suddenly you say this beautifully painted white space is, blue in color. So you have this blue paint that has kind of taken over the whole place. But that's fine. It's fine, because that's the kind of aesthetic of the mess that that has worked itself out. And then we said, it doesn't work because that blue paint is, it's messing up. It's bringing less light into that place. So the next time they painted it, they brought it back to the white paint that, changed the light quality in that place. So I think this is exactly what, like, the whole working out of things, right? Like working out with the messiness is something that one has to learn to deal with.
You were recently part of the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh. What were you showing there?
So like I said, we have one foot in the art space, and we were invited to the Dhaka Art Summit. So there were two. One was the larger theme that Diana Campbell, who was the curator of the Art Summit, she sort of had this provocation of actually the Bona, the flood. And so she had invited us to bring one of our works that we had presented earlier at the Museum of Contemporary Art at Barcelona, which was called The Belly of the Strange. And it was there it was basically a kind of invitation by Rux Media Collective at Barcelona. The provocation that they had given us there was to look at strange books that children read, books that children don't find strange because they've not been socialized into a kind of space of rationality. So Rux Media Collective at Makba were inviting us to make a transactional space for these strange books. So we built this kind of real big kind of bulbous space in the middle of Richard Meyer's kind of white cube, which was in some ways, polluting that space. It was this kind of, bulbous space that sort of wrapped around a wall. It was this kind of space of the imagination for the child, but also the kind of child in the adult. So when Akanksha was sort of inviting us to Dhaka Art Summit, she wanted us to build the next version of The Belly of the Strange, but now to respond to the idea of very small feelings, also the idea of Bona. So we built this space now at the Dhaka Art Summit, which was also the next belly, which was now this kind of longer space. It was on many legs, the strange creature-like space. Also because of the Bona, it was sort of lifted up above the ground. And it was the space for now also strange books, but now these books were made by artists along with indigenous communities that brought in their own life worlds, so worlds of forest and worlds of various kinds of environments that you inhabited and told stories of. So those were the spaces that were in the belly. And then through the Dhaka Art Summit, there were performances that happened. There were all kinds of people who were invited to read the books, but also engage with them, perform, do all kinds of things. So,
Yeah.
so the space was then also an open script over the last, over the, it's a short time. It's only 11 days, but the number of people who actually visit, I was told there were 55,000 people a day visiting the
Whoa.
space. So it's a really, really public space. There's students who come from schools and,
Hmm.
all kinds of places.
So how did the reception of this artwork differ in Dhaka versus when you showed it at the Venice Biennale or the Barcelona Museum of Contemporary Art? There's such different settings.
Right, right. Absolutely, absolutely. So Venice was the first provocation, right? And that was, it was not the belly, it was these transactional objects there in 2015, but it was curated by Okwi Envezer. And it was a super important, provocation. It was called, Of All the World's Futures. So for us, it was to kind of look at bringing in an idea of the future, which was not a kind of modernist future out there, but again, like we said, speaking from South Asia, what would it mean to think of a future that is incremental, a future that is built from a speculation of what the next step that these transactional objects, transactional spaces could take, because these are constantly transforming. So it was kind of a thought experiment, in a kind of form which was sort of a cross between art and architecture for us. And it's that the provocation was an important thing for us to make. That was at Venice. In Barcelona, it became more concrete as a space, that one could inhabit, but also kind of then, basically kind of, completely, bringing in, changing that white cube box. So bringing in, making it softer, so all kinds of people imagine, also, engaged with the place in Barcelona. It sort of, like we said, it was for the child, but also the child in you. So you could see people engaging with those, and people brought in their own associations, because suddenly this whole sort of bulbous belly that was in that, you would see people saying, "Oh, this reminds me of, a fruit that I ate when I was a child." Somebody says it reminds me of this cartoon character that was really kind of special to me. And it sort of brought in, series of associations. And so in some ways also kind of brought in a completely different, imaginative engagement in the place. And then when it comes to Dhaka, it's just the sheer number of people, that flooded the place. It was amazing when we were building it. Of course, it's a completely different setting. You saw those people outside. So just outside the Dhaka Art Summit, there was this fair going on, and you saw like the number of people who visited it, and we were like, oh my God, when the day it opens, this is the number of people who are going to, be in the belly. They're going to inhabit the belly. And it was also, again, I forget to mention this detail, which is super important, that when it came to Dhaka, it was also about how you made it, because in Barcelona, it was made, by contractors who were actually, a team that had also done some work for Zaha Hadid. So they kind of figured out the curves, and, they it was built with plywood and bent ply and all of that. In Dhaka, we worked with the local artisans who, were really adept in working with bamboo. So it was a bamboo structure, and it was a paper mache structure. Paper mache is also a tradition in Bangladesh, where you have the fine art students making these huge sculptures of paper mache, and they kind of create this carnival in spring. They walk around with it. Of course, you don't inhabit it. This time they were also inhabiting it. So the fine arts students actually worked for 4 or 5 days, actually making that space with paper mache there. So what was interesting is just this kind of sheer, cultural change, in working with certain kinds of people, engaging with certain kinds of people there. So yeah, it was a great experience.
What you were mentioning about the artisans that you worked with, it reminds me of also the pandals that are built in India
Yes.
because
Yeah.
they're specialized in bamboo construction. And then you mentioned paper mache, and it's
Yeah.
like using limited, very cheap construction resource to make something just spectacular.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was fantastic just seeing them work. Like really sort of. So like I said, it was the second trip. The first trip, we went to various places. We kind of there was part of our field work also, but we also took a small model. It was a maquette, and we showed it. So it was made with paper mache, and we took it to one of the carpenters who worked there in this place called Shilpakala for 30 years. That's where the summit was going to be. And he saw the model and he says, of course, it's easy. It's like this kind of strange bulbous space. And they like, of course I can do it. There's no question about it. And then it sort of gave you the
Wow.
confidence, it's like, okay, I know this will get done.
Yeah.
So it was really amazing. That smile, I can't still forget that smile on his face when he saw that model.
So, how do you balance the world of architecture and the art world? How do those two of those interact and interface?
I think they are completely enmeshed. One without the other would be
Mm-hmm.
impossible. Because I think what the art space does is sort of, allows you to open up several kind of,
Mm-hmm.
provocations, ways of thinking. Sometimes in the architecture space, you tend to, work with normative tools because there are certain precedents that you work with, and then
Mm-hmm.
you keep following them, and there's certain ways of doing things. Like Venice was the first provocations. It was not the belly, it was these transactional objects there in 2015, but it was curated by Oqui Envisor, and it was a super important provocation. It was called Of All the World's Futures. So for us, it was to kind of look at bringing in an idea of the future, which was not a kind of modernist future out there, but again, like we said, speaking from South Asia, what would it mean to think of a future that is incremental, a future that is built from a speculation of what the next step that these transactional objects, transactional spaces could take, because these are constantly transforming. So it was kind of a thought experiment, in a kind of form which was sort of a cross between art and architecture for us. I think the art space sort of
Mm.
completely helps you rethink and question things anew. And I think that's what is really, really important, how the art space is able to bring in new provocations to the practice. And I think the architectural space is something that sort of helps you embed, because you're embedded into, material practices, cultural practices in a lot more,
Mm.
fine grained ways. So I think that those are really kind of, they both sort of, speak to each other, they feed each other. And I think that's something that we bring to our pedagogical practice as well.
Mm.
Like we sort of, when we teach, we kind of bring in these questions of provocations. Um, we also, a couple of years ago, curated an architecture exhibition at an important space which is called the Jawahar Kala Kendra, and it was a building that was designed by Charles Correa, another very important architect from India, and it was in the city of Jaipur, which is also a very interesting city that was set up by this the city builder Savai Jai Singh. Completely different city building principles. It was
Mm-hmm.
located on a grid, but he was also kind of reworking some of the environmental infrastructures, water systems, and other things in that place. And so we worked with both, the design principles of Korea, who was completely, he questioned
Mm.
architectural type. Like when he was given a project like a mall, he would completely rethink the big box type and make it into a bazaar, where people could come and sort of,
Mm-hmm.
participate in this kind of the event of the bazaar. So we worked with the design principles of Korea and the principles of Savai Jai Singh's city planning. And we invited artists and architects in a provocation where the title of the exhibition was called "When is Space?" Or
Mm.
when does space get produced? So again, the kind of Lefebvrean idea that space is not a given
Hmm.
entity; it's a produced entity. So it was a provocation again that sort of came from our engagements with art, but also sort of inviting both architects and artists as spatial practitioners to then respond to these provocations. There were people who were making pavilions. There were people who were, bringing their own practices in conversation with other practices.
With all of this in mind, what are the goals and outcomes for this project?
So I think again, what is interesting for me is the kinds of people who are engaged in this and the group that we've brought. I mean, the kind of group that I've also sort of put together because we have smaller groups within it is certain people who are interested in the idea of the everyday. You know, and I think that is a debate that I would like to bring in. The questions of what does it mean to think of new monsoon from the questions of the everyday, from the questions of the entanglements, and I think what would be nice is to kind of see how this perspective sort of then comes together with
Hmm.
the other three perspectives. Um, I mean, I don't know where it will go today, but just sort of revisiting some of those, I think the conference itself will be an interesting place where we're able to bring these multiple ways of thinking together. And hopefully, the book that we put together will, bring in a new way of looking at climate change, of questions of the environment, which I think is very important today. And I think there are lots of people who are working with this, but like lots of scholars who are working with these questions. But I think the perspectives that I hope the perspectives that we bring in would,
Hmm.
add to those debates.
What is one sign of hope about climate change in South Asia?
Okay. I think this would be, I think what is really important for me is to think of the questions of environment from questions of justice. What does it mean to think of environmental justice? And particularly because we have, people who are thinking of questions of environmental justice from various disciplines, from the disciplines of art, from architecture, from urban scholars. The idea would be also to extend that to think of spatial justice. What are questions of new ways of looking at spatial ecologies that bring in this question of environmental justice. I think for me that is really really important, and I hope that is a discussion that we will be able to build and add to in the future.
That's it for today's episode on the next monsoon. Next time, we'll be talking to Jason Kahns for an anthropological perspective on climate frontiers, borders, deltas, and development in Bangladesh.
We would like to give special thanks to Sam Lubowitz and Angelica Kramer at Cornell's Language Resource Center for their assistance with recording this podcast. Shivin Senavaratna not only co-hosts this podcast, but is also our editor. Funding for the podcast and the entire Next Monsoon project comes from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please follow the South Asia program on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SAP Cornell. You've been listening to music by SAP Administrator Gloria Lemuz Chavez and her partner Brandon Kane. Make sure to check out more of their work in the show notes.
The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cornell's Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, or any other official entity of Cornell University.
I'm Daniel Bass.
And I'm Shivin Senavaratna.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode for new conversations and stories on the Next Monsoon.